Hi, it's Susan from World Peaceful and Happiness Australia, as I'm pretty much all of the above. I had a very interesting experience last week, which evoked within me a sense of who I am as an Australian. Now, it was really funny. I was at a TAFE and I saw this bloke with a stockman's jacket. And I just said to him, "Oh, you look like you're wearing a stockman's jacket. Are you from the high country?" And he goes, "Oh, it is a stockman's jacket." And he said, "Yes, I am from the high country." I went, "Really?" I said, "It's really funny. I did a video some time ago about the Australian fires. And as I was doing the video, I got inspiration around Clancy and the overflow. I told him this. And I said, I thought about the snowy mountains. And he goes, "Well, I was a stockman up in the snowies." And I said, "What do you think about them culling the brumbies?" And, of course, he wasn't happy, and neither am I. These are wild brumbies we have here in Australia, wild horses that run free up in the snowy mountains. This is real stockman's country, and it's cold. It's bloody cold. So they have to be pretty tough to be up there. But it's funny, my feeling just went to the Indigenous immediately, because these lands too are part of the dreaming, the clan that would have lived in the area. I know where a family member lives is actually a land, a part of the dreaming, which was, I think it was sacred women's business, actually. So I can easily go off onto the narrative about Australiana and forget the original stewards is what they are, because they were incredible. And that can be for another blog, but they are incredible, definitely. I feel them, and I know that they're ancient. But in respect of Anglo-Europeans that came to this country, which was very foreign, to us, there's also some wonderful stories of great courage, and harking back to the man I met at TAFE, who's come from the high country, who's actually ridden horses up in the snowy mountains, whose name, amazingly enough, was Clancy. Because I said to him, I talked about Clancy and the overflow, and he goes, "My name's Clancy." I went, "You're kidding me." "And you're a stockman from the high country." Well, I said, "That's a sign." I said, "I was talking about Clancy, in that video about the fires, because what I was evoking, or what the inspiration was that I was evoking, was the Australian character, which is very strong." Before I read The Man from Snowy River, because I'm going to read you Banjo Patterson, who was a great Australian poet, to remind people of who we are, I'm also going to add in here that I did read recently a story of Australians when they were captured during the Second World War. I would assume it would be by the Japanese. And they found themselves in a camp. They're not internment camps. I don't know what the Japs would have called them. Prisoner of war camps they were. And what I was reading was about the Australian character, and it was from a book about Australian history, actually. It was about Australian democracy that I'd taken from the library, and I didn't know this story. But it was around the culture of Australians. And what they were saying was people were in great hardship in these prisoner of war camps. And, of course, certain cultural traits expressed, given the culture you came from. They said that the Americans, when they were going through real hardship in this camp, they tended to trade for money. Like they tried to trade for food. So there was a kind of a business ethic around them. The British went into hierarchy. I'm superior to you. I'm your commanding officer. You're next rank. So they had a rank and file in respect of getting food. The Australians had none of it. They were sharing everything with each other. And I really felt when I read that really is a true Australian character, because we were not money oriented. That's been infiltrated into Australia. And, Australians have, in many respects, succumbed to this global culture of trade. But, it's not that long ago. And it's in my lifetime, definitely. I mean, I didn't grow up with this great emphasis on career, not at all. I grew up with an attitude of just, do what you want, but don't come home too late, although I did. My poor mother used to lie there with one eye open waiting. A bit scary when you come in. I used to come in sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning. I used to walk home on my own. That sort of courage I developed young in life because I got used to doing everything for myself. My parents used to make me ride, 10, 15 kilometres if I want something. I wasn't one of these cotton-wool children that gets picked up and taken everywhere. If I want something, I have to go and get it. That's what I was taught. So I just wanted to share some of that with you, but I want to read The Man from Snowy River because I really felt connection to Clancy. And I don't know if Banjo Patterson actually met a real guy called Clancy. Maybe he did. I certainly met a real guy called Clancy who was a bushman, rode horses, and he's alive today. Good news. Spirit's not dead yet, thank God. So, without further ado, let me try and read this. I'll try to read it well, but please forgive me if I stumble. I actually haven't done a pre-read. I never usually do. I just go straight into it. So this is by Banjo Patterson for you Australians who have forgotten, or you young ones who have never heard of him, because I don't even know if they're reading this at school, and they should be. I might just show you the book for teachers. I think you need to remind children where they come from. Of course, we were the convicts that were sent out from England. And if we're a little bit rebellious, it's because we've come from the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots, who were, the workers in so-called Great Britain. I don't see any country as per se great. I think they're all great. But let's just say where I'm sort of coming from is that working class spirit, which is deeply wired into me from childhood. And we had a humility about us, when we were young. We weren't given too much. Parents struggled. We had enough to eat. We believed in speaking up. We weren't transfixed to computers or televisions or iPhones. Back then, there were no iPhones. I remember the first phone, which was a big brick. That was your first mobile. It was huge. We used to have the dial phones. Our number was 812289. How's that? I still remember. And I can even remember going out bush and getting those old phones, and it was AB and you press a button. That was when I went around Australia when I was 20. That was before they sealed the Hume Highway, all the way around. They don't call that now. Princess Highway. They had, bits and pieces of bitumen, and you'd have to go 2 tyres on the dirt, 2 tyres on the bitumen as you head up. And, of course, Australia's vast. This is a big country. This is a huge country, but we've got small populations. So we had the experience truly of freedom here. And we grew up as equal. There was none of this. We knew there were people with lots of money, but the era I grew up in, they weren't full of themselves back then. We didn't have the class system. Everybody knew they could make their own way in the world. So that's very ingrained in me. I have no interest in the class system at all. And I think it's untrue. And, it embeds inequality, and then we help those and we don't help the other. So this is why I want to take you back to your roots for those Australians who are listening to this. And really everybody can share in this, whether you're, Caucasian Australian or whether you're, Italian Australian or whatever you are, it doesn't really matter. This is the beauty of being Australian. We don't care. You're all included. It's like we do accept everybody. We've had our moments without doubt, but there is within the Australian character, she'll be right, mate, no worries. And we'll just get on with it, eh? We have our negative traits, and I have seen that in other Australians, but by and large, what I would say is it's a very generous type of culture, and that we're willing to give people a fair go and we'll back the underdog. We tend to do that. And it's not even just Australians, I think. Around the world, you'll find people are like that. They feel for someone. We're really not that different, even globally. But let's just say there's a bit of a character here, and that's come from our past. So let me start with the man from Snowy River, eh? There was movement at the station, for the word had passed around that the colt from Old Regret had got away and had joined the wild bush horses. He was worth £1,000. Woo-hoo. So all the cracks had gathered to the fray. All the tried and noted riders from the stations near and far had mustered at the homestead overnight. For the bushmen love hard riding when the wild bush horses are, and the stock horse snuffs the battle with delight. I can imagine a horse doing that. There was Harrison, who made his pile with pardon, won the cup. The old man with his hair as white as snow. But few could ride beside him when his blood was fairly up. He would go wherever horse and man could go, and Clancy of the overflow came down to lend a hand. No better horseman ever held the reins, for never horse could throw him while the saddle girths would stand. He learnt to ride while droving on the plains. And one was there, a stripling on a small and weedy beast. He was something like a racehorse, undersized, with a touch of Timor pony, 3 parts thoroughbred at least, and such as are by mountain horsemen prized. He was hard and tough and wiry, just the sort that won't say die. There was courage in his quick, impatient tread. This is the horse, by the way. And he bore the badge of gameness in his bright and fiery eyes, and the proud and lofty carriage of his head. But still so slight and weedy, one would doubt his power to stay. And the old man said, "That horse will never do for a long and tiring gallop, lad. You'd better stop away. Those hills are far too rough for such as you." So he waited sad and wistful. Only Clancy stood his friend. "I think we ought to let him come," he said. "I warrant he'll be with us when he's wanted at the end, for both his horse and he are mountain bred. He hails from the Snowy River, up by Kosciuszko's side, where the hills are twice as steep and twice as rough, where a horse's hooves strike firelight from the flint stones every stride. The man that holds his own is good enough, and the Snowy River riders on the mountains make their home, where the river runs those giant hills between. I've seen full many horsemen since I first commenced to roam, but nowhere yet such horsemen have I ever seen." So he went. They found the horses by the big mimosa clump. They raced away towards the mountain's brow, and the old man gave his orders. "Boys, go get 'em, go at 'em from the jump. No use to try for fancy riding now. And Clancy, you must wheel them. Try and wheel them to the right. Ride boldly, lad, and never fear the spills. For never yet was rider that could keep the mob in sight, if once they gain the shelter of those hills. So Clancy rode to wheel them. He was racing on the wing, where the best and boldest riders take their place. And he raced his stock horse past them, and he made the rangers ring with the stock whip as he met them face to face. Then they halted for a moment while he swung the dreaded lash. But they saw their well-loved mountain full in view, and they charged beneath the stock whip with a sharp and sudden dash, and off into the mountain scrub they flew. You can imagine the horses bolting into the scrub. That's what we used to call the bush, the scrub. Then fast the horsemen followed, where the gorges deep and black resounded to the thunder of their tread, and the stock whips woke the echoes, and they fiercely answered back from cliffs and crags that beetled overhead. And upward, ever upward, the wild horses held their way as they're bolting up the hills, where mountain ash and Currajong grew wide. And the old man muttered fiercely, "We may bid the mob good day. No man can hold them down the other side." When they reached the mountain summit, even Clancy took a pull. It well might make the boulders hold their breath. The wild hop scrub grew thickly, and the hidden ground was full of wombat holes. And any slip was death, because a horse can put its foot in the wombat hole. You're done. And he swung his stock whip round, so he's obviously swinging it, and gave a cheer, woohoo! And he raced him down the mountain like a torrent down its bed. So that's a torrent of water. While the others stood and watched in very fear. Jesus, I would have said, Jesus Christ. No blasphemy intended there. He went the flintstones flying, but the pony kept his feet. He cleared the fallen timber in his stride, so he's jumped over. And the man from Snowy River never shifted in his seat. It was grand to see that mountain horseman ride. Through the stringy barks and saplings, on the rough and broken ground, down the hillside at a racing pace he went, and he never drew the bridle till he landed safe and sound at the bottom of that terrible descent. He was right among the horses as they climbed the further hill, and the watchers on the mountain standing mute saw him ply the stock whip fiercely, because he was cracking it, and he was right amongst them still as he raced across the clearing in pursuit. Then they lost him for a moment, where two mountain gullies met in the ranges, but a final glimpse reveals, on a dim and distant hillside, the wild horses racing yet, with the man from Snowy River at their heels. And he ran them single-handed till their sides were white with foam. He followed like a bloodhound on their track till they halted, cowed and beaten. Then he turned their heads for home, and alone and unassisted brought them back. But his hardy mountain pony, he could scarcely raise a trot. The horse was buggered. I'm just translating. He was blood from hip to shoulder from the spur. Oh, poor horse, because he would have been, going. But his pluck was still undaunted, and his courage fiery hot, for never yet was mountain horse a cur. So this is talking about the courage of the horse. I really like that. And down by Kosciuszko, this is the mountain, where the pine-clad ridges raise their torn and rugged battlements on high, where the air is clear as crystal and the white stars fairly blaze at midnight in the cold and frosty sky, and where around the overflow The reeds beds sweep and sway to the breezes, and the rolling plains are wide. The man from Snowy River is a whole household word today. And the stockmen tell the story of his ride. And that's that. This is a really interesting book. I really like it. You know, my father used to have the old paintings of the old houses. You know, these were the homesteads. Dad really liked. He really connected to the old Australia. And my father really was part of that era. He was hardworking. He was honest. But I can remember a man hassling a woman, and my father, he stepped in and he said, are you all right, to the woman? And the bloke said something to me. He ignored the bloke. He just said, are you okay? Do you need my help? And she goes, oh, no, it'll be okay. And I remember, you know, I was with him. I remember thinking, good on him. He was going to save that woman and he would take the bloke on. Dad had a hard life. You know, he's grown up in poverty, my father, and you've got to make your own way in the world. And it breeds within people, you know, this attitude of inferiority of those who are poor is a misconception. They're actually very tough. You know, you have to be tough to survive, you know, when you've come from challenges like that. I just want to show you some of these pictures. They look really interesting. Let's do with the horses. Yeah, I've got a family member living up in the Snowy Mountains, and there's a lot of crystals in the ground up there. I've driven through the Snowies because I'm from Canberra, so I've driven that way, and I've just loved the country. And I've been up to Mount Kosciuszko at the turn of the millennium, 2000. It was an impulse. I had a partner at the time and some friends were with us. And we just said, why don't we go up, let's climb Mount Kosciuszko and reach the summit by the morning. We started at 3 a.m. and we had sleeping bags around us, you know, like wraps. And we just walked to the summit. It took about 3 hours and it was pretty dark, so we didn't see much. So we get to the summit and there's just cloud all around. And this was, for me, symbolic of we're at the highest point in Australia at that turn. And this was around the Y2K millennium. I never believed that at the time, and I was right. Nothing happened. But I felt very strongly to be there. The highest point in Australia felt right. So I climbed the mountain, and then we watched all the mist disappear, and then we could see all the you know, for Australia, hills. You know, Banjo Patterson said it right. They're hills. They're not mountains. New Zealand's got mountains. But nonetheless, we looked at the vista and it was just beautiful and the air was really crisp. And then when we made our way back down the mountain, there were boulders, like huge rocks. It was like something from space being dropped. All these boulders dropped on the mountain because I hadn't seen them walking up. And then I saw them walking back and I just blew my mind. So I've decided I'm going to share with you something my father wrote about his father. And I want to premise this by saying that I saw some boys yesterday riding their bikes, and I was happy to see them riding bikes, not on iPhones, because when I grew up, we all went out into the bush. You know, we rode bikes and we all went out. We lived pretty wild, you know, back then, because our parents gave us lots of freedom. They weren't worried. There was no great fear, you know. And Canberra was a small place back then, you know, and we all knew each other. I knew loads of people. But I used to go out on my own. I used to hitchhike. Sometimes for fun, you know, just do it just to see if I could meet people on the way. I can remember hitching and some police picked me up. Some nice cops, they were lovely, and giving me a lift home. See, in those days, things were much lighter. And it was funny. They ended up going and checking some house, and I ended up taking off. Decided I hadn't finished my night, so I kept going. They probably thought, where'd she go? And another time I can remember hitching and two cars stopped. I decided to interview them. So I said hello to the first car, guy, who was in there. And then there was a second car which had a couple. I thought I'll go with them. So I did. Another time, I just want to tell you this because it's about getting into life. It's not about getting out of life. It's about getting into it. And sometimes you've got to confront your fears. People say, oh, God, you shouldn't hitch as a girl. Well, I did, and I was fine. I'm going to turn the heater down because it's getting a bit hot. So I'll just tell you about this other time I hitched. And, because I used to go out drinking and dancing and having fun, but it was all innocent. And in those days, people were really innocent. It was good. So I was making my way to Queanbeyan, I think. She's just out of Canberra. And this car, what was it? Just wondering if it was a limo. No, I don't think it was a limo. I think it was a car full of guys. You'd be going, oh, you didn't. I did, because I wasn't scared. There was no way I was after anything, but I wasn't scared. I had no fear. So I jumped in the car. These guys gave me a lift to where I needed to go. I got out. Nothing happened. How's that? Same thing happened when I was over in the States, actually. Myself and another Australian, when we were on a Kentucky tour, we asked a limo driver for a lift. Took us on a tour. Just trying to think where we were. It was in Houston, I think. And there were guys in the car. I think we were offered a beer or something. I don't know. They had us stocked with drinks. The driver dropped the guys off and he took us out. Nothing happened. It was just, we were shown places, danced, and then he drove us back to the bus. How's that? See, things like this happen. It's not all, oh, you'll be attacked. Oh, they've got an alternative motive. Experiences I had where people were nothing but nice. And because I came from that innocence, or I trust people, and I still do trust people. I'm aware as well, but I do trust people on the whole. That came from my childhood where I just stepped out. And I didn't worry. And that's what happens when you grow up without fear. With all the fear that we're generating in the world, people won't do anything. It's too scared. Oh, you'll be attacked. Oh. Now I've come to understand that what you think about, you bring about. So if I'm living in fear, I'm attracting it. And the same happens with abuse situations in our world. If people are living in great fear, they can actually attract the very thing that they're frightened of. They've got to be very careful because people, like what I said in the previous video about the masks, if people see you as vulnerable, they'll go for you if they are bullying, if they've got an energy of bullying about them, where they want to feel the power. That's what they're after. So it's very important. Empowerment's important because we lose fear as we become more empowered. And if you're worried about dying, well, you've got to face that. If you're worried about being, sexually attacked, you've got to face it. But you don't let it alter your life. You don't let it stop you from living. I went around the world by myself as a definite step to confront my fear. Because I see the fear as the barrier. The enemies of humankind, they say, are fear and falling, believe it or not. They say with a baby, that's the only thing they're the things that are problematic for a baby is the fear of falling. It's the fear of falling with babies. Guilt and fear are the two enemies. If we're to use a word like enemies, I don't typically use that word. But if you're to look at something that's not working for you, guilt is one of them. And living in constant fear. Because you will shut yourself down. It's self-censoring. You're self-censoring. And you're going, oh, I really want to do that. Oh, I'm too scared. What if this happens? What if that happens? Stop watching TV and you'll deprogram. I didn't watch TV for years. And that's where I became fearless, you see. I'm not saying I don't have fears, I do. But I'm the sort of person that's likely to face it. I'm not going to run away. I would rather face it. So I want to read you a little bit from what my dad's written, with my daddy's permission. Dad passed away last year, so I don't think he'll mind. But the reason I talked about the 3 boys that I saw riding was because I was contemplating on the boys without their fathers. And I believe a lot of the abuse that's happened in our country has come from absent fathers. It's come from a lineage, too, of abuse in male situation. And this is not to say that women don't do it. They do. They certainly have. There's evidence of that for sure. And I've seen it. But the absence of the fathers is really, really important because the boys need their dads. What you'll find is, and I saw this even with my own dad, because girls tend to model off their mums. Your mother might cook and, we just copy, children do that. The boys will copy from their dads. And it's very funny because I remember when I saw my younger brother many years ago when I came back from England, he could only cook one meal at the time. I'm sure he can cook more now. It was pork and rice. And I was really amazed. And I just thought, that's what Dad cooked. That's all Dad cooked. And yet Mum had cooked heaps of food. He didn't remember that. He remembered what Dad cooked. And I thought, yeah, the modelling by gender, it's really powerful. So the boys need their dads. And the world of work has taken fathers from their children, now taking mothers from their children as they get daycare in there. So children are actually getting removed from family and parenting, which I think is a major, major problem. This is where insecurity builds. This is where unhappiness and emptiness grows because the child's development is being stunted by not getting the love the child needs. And I'm just going to throw in another point here. When I was in the baby houses in Russia with Patch Adams, he's a clown doctor. He didn't come on this particular clown expedition. I had a whole lot of other clowns. We were heading off to the baby house. There's actually footage on my YouTube channel. And that was actually a powerful experience for me because I was visiting, it was, I'm just thinking if it was a hospital. I think it was a hospital. But they had something like firstborns to 5 years old. And we came in as clowns to connect with the children, to give them love, actually, because the children get love. That's why Patch was doing these tours in Russia. He was going to the orphanage. Maria, from Maria's Children, she was the one that organised it. She didn't speak English, but she wrote to Patch out of a Russian-English dictionary. And Patch then committed to coming to Russia to visit these orphanages and baby houses, old people's homes. He ended up inviting people to come and be clowns in Russia. He was actually thawing the Russian-US, tensions. He was trying. It was a peace initiative, what he was doing. But nonetheless, I remember turning up at this hospital/orphanage, and I always remember a little child with big tears crying, like 3 years old, crying like really big tears. And I remember thinking there was trauma there. I felt it. I felt so sorry for these children because they had no parents looking after them. Very tough for them. And they can become, we were told, imbecile if they have not received enough love by the age of 5. They go crazy, which is why love is my mantra. It's for mental health. It's also for full development of the human being. This is why children need love and nurturing. Up to 18 years of age. If you look at other species, they don't have that much time for nurturing it. And it shows you how important it is for human beings as a species. We need a lot of love to develop ourselves in a balanced way. It's that balance that causes peace on the planet. It's not an idealism. It's actually balance. So The baby houses and the orphanages showed me that, because we clowned in the orphanages. We clowned in a lot of orphanages. And I've clowned since then in India as well. But the children, they're clinging to each other, and you can see, they're really happy they've got the clowns coming in. But it's not easy for these kids. There's no family around them other than the other children they make friends with. So, it was interesting. I just want to add on too that we found out from some of the clowns found out that children had been also brought into prostitution rings. So there was mafia entering these places. So the most vulnerable people often get targeted by sexual predators and child traffickers. It's funny, I'm getting to know this subject a bit better now because I think it's important. The children are very vulnerable and they do get targeted. And we have a responsibility to all the children of the world, not just the ones in our own country. So I want to read a little bit of this. It's about my father, and he talks about digging up Desmond. Desmond was his father. And he says, Des was my dad. He left my mum and we 3 kids when I was 4. None of us ever saw him again. This baffled Mum. She always said he was like a bad penny and would turn up when you least expect him. He came from a family line, and I was really shocked when I read this, that can be traced back to the Crusades. Yay! He had the advantage of being born to a well-off family and made a mess of his life. Mum had 9 sisters and 1 brother. 9 sisters and 1 brother. Can you imagine that brother? He would have liked it. They all thought he was a great bloke, but they were proven wrong. They all said he could charm a bird off a tree. He left Mum and came back 2 times, so I guess that was true. She fell pregnant each time he came back. And he said, the last time he came back, I was born. I thank him, for which I thank him. Mum told one of her sisters it was all worth it. Apparently he was a great lover. Mum was gorgeous, but it's a fact of life that the sweetest of women sometimes pick the worst of blokes. It must be their mothering instinct. I did not start digging for Dad until I was in my 50s. My sister Dallas got my interest going. Most of what follows is anecdotal, and I'm putting it down because I find it interesting. My other 2 siblings thought I should despise him, but I do not. At the end of the day, we all make our own luck, and he just made bad luck instead of good. This will be a tale that wanders around from the subject a lot. I'm doing it for a program called The Making of Australia. The producers are probably up to their ears in more important stories, and it will not see the light of day. If that happens, I will leave the story to my grandchildren, who, because I butter them up extravagantly, will pass it on. Well, they'll have to pass it on now. It's going to go back and forward, sideways, and in fact, any way I wish to tell it. The centre theme will be Des, but I will bring in the Melbourne I knew. It's a rich tapestry woven in a different time, with the differing expectations of people. Des was born in 1907, 5 years after the end of the Boer War. Steamships were well and truly at the go, and most of the beautiful tea clippers were being used as coal hulks in the harbours of the world. Melbourne had 2 things singling it out. 1, the softest, purest water you can imagine. 2, a very poor sewerage system. As a plumber uncle of mine used to gleefully tell me, they call it Smellburn because it's warn't sewered. Because it warn't sewered. He's using old English there. It wasn't sewered. Oh, you can imagine. Des was one of 4 children. At the age of 7, his mother died. His father remarried a year later, and he and the other children were put into a Catholic boarding school. His father and new mother had a further 3 children, which left the first 4 out of the family home for a long period. On leaving school at the age of 16, he went into a seminary with the intention of entering the priesthood. Thinking it over, my mind boggles at the thought. A year later, he left and was a Catholic in name only thereafter. Mum said whenever the family visited them, he would leave copies of The Advocate, the Melbourne Catholic newspaper, around the house, but that was as far as it went. He met Mum in Perth, Western Australia. They both worked at Shell. He was an accountant, Mum was doing office work. He seduced her, not an easy thing to do to a respectable girl from a very straight-laced family. Birth control not being as readily available as it is now, Mum became pregnant with my brother Brian. Mum wanted to tell her family. Des told her if she did, he would not marry her. He eventually married her back in Melbourne to his father's horror. When Mum produced my brother Brian for grandmother's inspection, this is her mother, she was told in no uncertain terms that he looked too old for a 3-month premature baby. My grandma had run a hospital and could not be fooled. So this is my great-grandmother. I'm about to divert. If you cannot take that, skip a few paragraphs. Good old Dad. Grandma was a class act. Now, I want to talk and focus on Grandma as part of the Australian story that we don't actually talk about. We all go on about the men. In this case with my father, his own father let them down, and his own father was involved in abuse. So I want us to focus on my great-grandmother. This is the female story. Dad says that Grandma was a class act. She was born Emma Maria Gay. I'm going to show you a photo of her. See here? That's my grandma. Look how strong her face is. These were tough women, mate. Emma, or M, I think they called her, Maria Gay. She was young when she married Joe Howard, my grandfather. He was 40 years old at the time. She married him under the mistaken belief that, being twice her age, she would not have to have many children. Birth control by age. He was a moderately wealthy man. He played cricket for the gentlemen against the players and was a thoroughly bad businessman and a thoroughly nice guy. Between them, they had 11 girls and 1 boy, 12 in that family. My grandmother was one of 12. Their third girl, Adeline, died at the age of 10 months because she had not been christened into the Catholic faith. The family priest would not let her be buried on consecrated ground. The Howards left the Catholic faith and joined another church. In the Depression, he had not the heart to put non-paying tenants out of his houses. Good on you. Good on you, Gramp. My great-gramp. So he wouldn't evict people, basically, and let them go back to the bank, which meant that after his death, Grandma had to make a living through midwifery, using their large house as a private hospital. She did that for 8 years, then retired to a 1-acre block in Cheltenham. So my great-grandmother ran a hospital. It's very interesting. You know, this is at a time when women don't work, right? This woman, it was incredible. She had no trouble getting established. 10 daughters married to 10 guys meant that she had an inexhaustible source of labour. Plus the fact that she was very, very self-reliant. I well remember the last time I saw her. She was magnificent. A shock of white hair, strong face, and bombardine black dress. She was nearing the end of 10 years mourning for her husband. There she was standing in her front garden. It was all flowers, as the front garden should be. She had black boots and red and white striped football socks on. That's what I call a grandma. She used to take us alternatively, my brother Brian, my sister Dallas, and me. My turns were unforgettable. She had 1 acre of prime land in Cheltenham, Melbourne. The house on it was small, a long, lean cabin, perhaps 8 squares. Gas lighting was as soft as a mother's kiss. Outside you had the patio, which had iron trellis overhead with grapevines running through it, a tall almond tree to the left, from which was suspended a Coolgardie safe. That's how they called their food. The Coolgardie safe was a rectangular metal grill with a water-retaining base and on top a muslin veil, which received the evaporating water. Grandma kept her custard, milk, etc. in there, and it was very efficient. The backyard was the granary, all varieties of fruit trees and abundance of vegetables. Grandma kept her big family amply supplied. At the back of the cabin was a big cellar where Grandma kept preserves, cheeses, jams and more. In those days, there's no welfare. So this grandmother, great-grandmother of mine, raised 12 children, supplied them at a time that would have been extremely difficult. They were very impoverished in those days, so they had to be self-reliant. What Dad goes on to say is that when night came, Grandma would turn on the gas lighting and I would go to the end bedroom to sleep. I would sleep under a patchwork quilt. Each patch would have a story. This patch was from Auntie Kit's wedding dress. This was from my mother's first formal. By the time I got to the third, I was usually asleep, surrounded by family. Grandma had 10 girls and 1 very quiet boy. He later married a very dominating woman, and when she died, he married an even more dominating woman. Poor guy. There has to be a moral in that. I have a photo of Mary, the eldest girl, holding my mum as a baby in her arms. Any fights between Grandma's girls had to be settled one-on-one. If you complained to Grandma, she would tell the tale teller to go and tell the other to do it again. She hit me. Go back. Tell her to give you 1 more whack. That was Grandma, great-grandma. In other words, don't go fibbing. Sort your problems out. This worked like a charm, and there was great harmony amongst the girls and a close relationship with each other that lasted their lifetimes. Grandma's older girls were born at a bad matrimonial time. A lot of the boys they fancied went away to the Great War and either never came back or in such poor shape they never married. See, no one ever talks about that the guys, the soldiers that came back, they weren't all coming back to families and living happily ever after. Some of them were so traumatized that they couldn't even form relationships. See, we don't hear these stories. We only hear about the glory. So the girls married a reduced selection. It's really interesting that he puts it that way. However, the Howard girls stuck by their choices, with 2 exceptions, my mum and Auntie Edie. Cheltenham had the most marvellous growing soil. Mum and her sisters and many others helped set up Cheltenham Golf Course, a genuine sandbelt course. It was situated at the end of Grandma Street. I used to play at the age of 13 with a set of hickory shafted sticks that had more curves in them than Marilyn Monroe. Oh, Dad. Wooden tees were just coming in, and I could not afford them anyway. He couldn't even afford a little wooden tee. That's how poor they were. Each teeing area had a cement box with sand in it. One would make a pyramid out of sand, mount the ball on it, and off you went. There were many market gardens run mainly by the Chinese. Grandma mistrusted the Chinese, but she was fair. She also mistrusted all foreigners and anyone of a different colour, which was typical of Australians of that era. Anyone with the semblance of a green thumb would eat very well from their own garden. I would walk down to the nearby dairy and get a gill of milk straight from the cow. A gill from memory was about 3/4 of a litre. I can remember going down to the jetty of Kiefer's boat shed at Black Rock. The water was so clear one could see down and see catfish swimming some 2 metres below. See, we'd have trouble today, wouldn't we? Grandma could be had. Oh, this is a funny story. My cousin Johnny Gardner, aged 9, and I, aged 7, caught Grandma on the dunny down the back. It was almost like catching God on the loo. We opened the hatch at the back and saw Grandma's wrinkly bottom over the pan and called, "See ya bum, Grandma." We never heard a word back. My mother and us 3 kids would have done badly without Grandma. I still remember her, still love her. Getting back to Des and Mum, they married in 1929. Des worked in Melbourne as a salesman. It was nearly the height of the Great Depression. In 2 years, almost 1 in 3 would be out of work. So people are talking about the Great Depression now with COVID-19, aren't they? So 1 in 2 out of work. Well, Latrobe predicted 40% will be unemployed. I'm just contemplating that for a moment. The Depression ripped the social fabric apart. Families, including ours, broke up. So this is where the abuse starts in Australia, is the Great Depression actually, because the families fell apart. They couldn't hold them together. This is why we're dealing with these Senate inquiries into institutional child abuse. Children went into institutions. So the Depression, the war, the collapsing of the country. I'm just sitting with it because I'm seeing financiers. The market at that time could not sustain the society. This was at a time where Keynesian economics actually emerged, because he was saying that the government has to inject funds into the economy in order to keep people spending. The problem was that when people lost their jobs, there was a downward spiral. So the idea was for the government to pump prime. The reason we got social welfare was to ensure there was enough liquidity so that people could continue purchasing. Consumption was used to ensure standards of living. So this is how the economics formulated. But that Great Depression, it's come out of the First World War and the Second World War. It was around the Second World War. Well, 1929, they got married, so 1930s, and of course the war was happening. Yep. And that may well have been what triggered the Great Depression, was the wars. So something to contemplate as we have to resolve these conflicts. He goes on to say that crime increased. Okay, families broke up, crime increased, and the Labor Party started to make inroads into the conservative establishment. Archbishop Mannix ruled Melbourne's Irish Roman Catholics. He was deeply resented by the conservative elite. He supported Home Rule for Ireland and trade unions. At the end of his life, like so many radicals, his views were overtaken by time, and he became very conservative. Inner Melbourne was, and it is now, my dad says, a corrupt place. So straight-laced on the surface and patches of bloody evil underneath, he said. In 1924, they had the police strike. Melbourne suffered looting and the army was called in. None of the police who went on strike were ever employed on the force again. See, and that's your tension between the unions and those in authority who don't want unions, because that tension is really about collective action because people don't have power on their own. So it's forms of advocacy. Yet it gets labelled as, oh, the left-wing trade unions. And that's not to say the unions weren't corrupt. They were, and, as time went on, they got corrupt too. There was corruption going on. But ultimately what the great fear was the collective organisation of people. And those in power didn't want that, which was unfortunate because it's really about maintaining that balance between the two so that these people get a reasonable amount of income to survive because they need to be heard. See, that not being heard happened back then too. He goes on to say that in 1927, when his dad was 20, Squizzy Taylor, he sounds like a hoodlum, doesn't he? A notorious criminal killed Snowy Cutmore. Cutmore's a good name. Who was even worse. Snowy was sick in bed, and Squizzy, hearing the good news, decided to even things up. Shot and that is right. Shot and dying. Oh, that's terrible. Snowy had enough strength to pull a revolver from under the pillow and in turn mortally wounded Squizzy, which everyone agreed was a good thing. 28 shots were fired from nearby point-blank range. They must have been atrocious shots. The strange thing was that Snowy's revolver was later found in a garden 3 houses away. Squizzy took a taxi to St Vincent's Hospital where he died on the operating table. So with great poverty comes the breakup of families, comes organised crime. It flourishes because people get desperate. People are trying to survive. And then violence breaks out. These are the cycles of violence, what causes them. So it's not hard to work out if you don't want violence. You have to get it right at the family level. You have to get it right with the parenting. The men have to stick around their families and commit. If you're a father, you've got to commit and stay with your children. If there's problems with the relationship, you need counselling. You've got to work it as best you can for the sake of the children. So Dad's going on to say that his father was right into that environment. So his father was a bit of an unsavoury character, but he didn't know him. He's just going off stories he was told. Mum said he had borrowed money from his father, friends, and whoever would lend him some. He was a gambler and womanizer. They had an on and off relationship until 1938 when he left for good. War broke out in 1939 and Des enlisted at Caulfield Racecourse, which was the only place big enough to handle the crowds of people signing up. He had been in the cadets at school and later the militia. In late 1940, he was promoted to Staff Sergeant Signals and stationed at Seymour, which for a person like him must have been utterly boring. Over the past 4 years, when not seeing Mum, he had been living in Darling Street, Toorak, with one of the working girls. Darling Street was aptly named as it was the 1930s version of a red light street. When mentioned, it was always with a nudge and a nudge, wink, wink, say no more. I've got to fix this up because they're wanting to update my computer. No. So he went AWOL from Seymour in late 1941. It was a cushy job and there was no reason why he should have done that. A 33-year-old man in good condition who was not in uniform would have stood out in the Australia at that time. I think he went back to see his woman and found a new guy and taken his place. This is Dad just guessing. He doesn't know. So he goes on to say he was a gambler. Dad seems to think that he probably was killed and thrown in the Yarra. That's what he thinks. He thinks he was an unsavoury character. which it certainly sounds like he was. And that's not going to create a great foundation for a person. But in many respects, Dad was better off. So how did Des and his misdeeds, which according to my brother and sister included sexual abuse, affect us? For them a lot, for me a little at the time, though of course it did affect my future life. I could hardly remember him. Where we were lucky was in having grandma, mum and her sisters. And I just want to say the women are not acknowledged for keeping the families together. Like this great-grandmother of mine was truly a great woman. She was a hero, raising 13 kids and supporting them, running a hospital on her own. You just can't imagine the courage and how exhausted she must have been. But it doesn't get the acknowledgement it deserves. You know, the women aren't acknowledged for their courage. And also, they're holding their families together so these children have at least some chance. That's strong. I'd like to have met my great-grandmother. So it goes on to say they were such truly beautiful people. So this is Dad's impression of his grandmother and his mother and his sisters. He said that made up for everything. Mum got a job as one of the first women assembly workers in Melbourne. The only reason she was employed was that most of the men had gone into the services. So there was your bias. You know, women had to leave those jobs when the men came back. This is the inequality gender-wise. She would walk into the factory and all the men would whistle, "Ida, sweet as apple cider," which was a popular song in those days. After the war, Mum lost the job as returned servicemen were given preference. Yeah, interesting. My brother was a natural entrepreneur, and from a very early age he taught me how to make a shilling, selling papers, race books and whatever I could. We lived in the Melbourne suburb of Armidale over a shop. The railway line was close, and while the trains kept you awake at first, they were like a lullaby. Sorry, they kept him awake at first, but after a while it was like a lullaby, he's saying. I lived like a king at times. Over the road was a snowball factory, and you could get a dozen spoils for 3p. There were many similar bargains to be had for a shrewd negotiator. Everybody seemed to be poor. This was a good thing. There is nothing like having company. There was no television, so we did not realise how badly off we all were. The shop on the right of us was a gem. It was ostensibly a comic shop. The bargains were immense. One could buy a comic for 6p, read it and then trade it in for a 3p one. But that was not the end of it. One could take the 3p comic back and trade it in on a 1p comic. There were Boy's Own, Magnet, that's the name of the comics, Boy's Own, Dad's saying, Magnet, and other great titles. I want to show you a picture of Dad's mum as a little girl. That's my grandmother, Ida. I remember Grandma. I can remember going to her place in Melbourne because we used to drive from Canberra every year for Christmas, and she had a pot belly. I remember that. I always remember for some reason all the adults sitting at the big table and us children were all sitting at the little table. And one particular memory was when Grandma had cancer and she needed her feet rubbed, and I wanted to rub her feet, but my cousins who were living with her, they knew her really well, so they just went and rubbed her feet. And I always remember feeling kind of out of it, you know, like I really wanted to connect with my grandmother, but I wasn't able to. But I do remember her being a lovely woman. I do remember that. Dad said he, at some point, you know, he wondered about love, and he'd wanted the love of someone who would love him like his mother did unconditionally. But he never really had that. So he goes on to say that there was one illustrated booklet I bought at the age of 7 from the comic shop that shaped my thinking. It was called Cuthbert's Road to Success. Cuthbert was a knight taking part in the Crusades in the Holy Land. See, I didn't know anything about this. One day he and his fellow knights came to a narrow bridge where sat a Saracen on his little Arab mare. Nonchalantly laying on his shoulder was a whopping great scimitar. Sounds like Brian. Holy Grail. I can see the scene now. A scimitar. Anyway, you'd have to look at my blog to know what I'm talking about. He challenged Cuthbert's lot to send out a champion, which they duly did. The knights used to pride themselves on carrying a straight lance. Their best knight came thundering down with a laser-like lance, middled on the Saracen's chest. So much for using your words, dialogue. Anyway, put that aside. At the last moment, the little Arab mare sidestepped, as the knight thundered past, his head was cut clean off. Oh, I wouldn't write that. Anyway, it's Dad's story. All Cuthbert's party were taken aback, but tried it again a couple more times with the same result. Oh, that's terrible. In desperation, they turned to Cuthbert. At least he was expendable, as he was the worst knight you could ever see. At the jousts, his lance would swing in a giant parabola. Off Cuthbert went. At first, the Saracen was happy, thinking he had a bit more of the same coming. As Cuthbert got closer and the lance was covering a huge circle, he started to panic, and at the last second jumped his horse to the left, which, as it happened, was where Cuthbert's lance was. Squish! The Saracen was skewered. Oh, that's terrible. And Cuthbert a hero. Moral: if you are unpredictable, it makes up for a lot of shortcomings. That's my father's moral. That is hilarious. If you're unpredictable, it's not that he was unpredictable, it's the bloody horse that jumped the wrong way. So he was just on the horse and he had good luck, as Dad would say. Not bad luck that day. So you might wonder how the proprietor made a profit. He didn't. This is about the comics. Dad's jumping back now. We're nearly at the end now, so hang in there. The comics were a front for an illegal starting price bookmaker, SP, with the SP bookmakers here in Australia. He goes, I really loved Armidale. Halfway through our time there, Mum's new husband, Bill, came along. He was a hard man with a great son, Les, who I grew very fond of, but that is another story. I never saw Dad again after I was 4, and I didn't remember the occasion, probably buried in my subconscious. At the end of the day, we were better off without him than with him. Do I condemn him? No. He was a little 7-year-old who lost his mother and was cut off from his family. He boarded at Christian Brothers Melbourne. I spent my first year at school at the Sacred Heart Primary in St Kilda. It was a frightening place for a small child. Jesus crucified all around you, pictures of the devil that were designed to frighten the devil out of you. Nuns dressed prominently in black, with all their femininity suppressed by their order. I was only a day boy, and the young Des was at his school night and day. He had no mother, an absentee father, and he did not have my grandma. By the time he left the seminary, I guarantee he was buggered both figuratively and literally. More sinned against than sinning. That's what I say. And that's where he ends the story. So what that is obviously saying to me, there's your pedophilia, actually. My grandfather and the damage it did to his children. And there's other stories which I won't be saying that I know that caused great discord in the family. I'm just going to go still on that sexual and Catholicism, because this is a big issue with, we've had court hearings with Pell here in Australia. There's also inquiries into institutional child abuse. There's domestic violence. So we've got a serious problem here in Australia with abuse. That's something that's becoming apparent to me. And my dad only died last year, and I only found this out recently, that his siblings and himself, in a small way, had also suffered sexual abuse, and that the Catholic Church had allowed pedophilia, as Dad's stepbrother, Les, had been sexually abused. And actually Les died. I don't know how Les died, but he was young. The father never got over it, which was Dad's stepfather. And the stepfather gave my father a hard time, he says, because he was brokenhearted, you see, he lost his son, and Dad couldn't replace his son. But Dad really loved Les. And that's the other story, you know. Dad was very well read, because he used to escape into books, trying to deal with extreme poverty. But as he said in his story, it wasn't so bad when everybody was poor. You know, you're not standing out like, you know, that's the slum area. So maybe in the times we're moving through today, where people are experiencing the collapse of businesses, the shutdown is slowing activity, it's taking, 20% off GDP. People were forced to stay home, confront their stuff. And not that the government was doing it as a form of therapy. It wasn't. It has another agenda. But it gives us time for reflection. I feel that the pedophilia issue is a big issue, and I believe it needs to be confronted. I saw the pain in my father when I was young, and I didn't understand it. I actually thought it was my mother's fault because they fought. But in actual fact, that pain was not from my mother. It was coming from his childhood. It was coming from an absent father, and a history there that wasn't one to be proud of. And Dad had to find himself. He was a very gentle person, my father. He was not aggressive. I just want to go still for a moment, then I'll close, because this is about Australia. And of course, I started out with poetry, didn't I? Banjo Patterson, Snowy River. And what I was really sharing with everybody was this very tough Australian spirit. And in the Snowies, it was the courage to go and chase after that horse, the old regret. So to have no regret, go after it. My father had a lot of courage. He was not a weak man, but he was not a violent man. I was very, very lucky. I had a very safe father, a very kind father, a real father. And I'm grateful to him for being such a wonderful dad to me. But he had a hard life, and he didn't tell us everything. So I want to go still in honour of my father for a moment. I'm seeing the billabong straight away. I'm tuning into the Australian culture, the folklore, who we are. The billy, the swag. So homeless who have swags, they actually have swags. This is part of our history. We are in it together is a theme here. We're to have the courage of Clancy from the overflow when things look tough. But know that we've been through the Great Depression before and we survived. So we're a very, very tough people in actual fact. We're strong. The women were incredibly strong, and they have not been given the credit that they deserved. The mothers who stood by their children, they didn't leave them. Some did, but majority, 99%, didn't. The men were spun off more because they lost themselves. As Dad said with his father had been abused, sexually abused, when he was young. And that's why he was womanizing and gambling. He was seeking pleasures through addictions because he was very detached from himself, because he had been hurt as a child. His mother had died when he was only 7. And then the father remarries, and those children, those first 4 children, are just discarded as if they don't need them anymore because the new wife doesn't want these children. I mean, that's a shocking thing to do to people's children. That wife should have taken those kids in as their own, but she didn't. And that created a lineage which has affected me today. I'm the person I am today probably because of that lineage. But I was lucky. I had a very kind father. And he was tough, you know, he was not a weak man. So I had a very good role model in my father. The feeling I have is we're to go back to the high country. We're to heal, and we're to remember the courage that we all have to confront life where we're fearful and move through it like Clancy of the overflow. We're to remember the snowy mountains, the snowy river, the man from Snowy River. He's our man. And there's probably the woman from Snowy River, but as I said before, the women tend to get sidelined. There's a lot of great women. I'm going to think of my grandmother, Em. She's going to be my hero. She kept the family together and she supported her daughter who had no husband. There's no welfare. So stay true to who you are and don't allow fear to divide us as a people. Because we are going into very tough times, that's true. But it's going to bring out the best in us. We will get through all of this, and there will be a very, very bright future once we get through what we need to go through in the future. Okay, the short term. In the long term, it's going to be good. I can only just share that with you because I know that to be true. All right. So with that, I send you love. I send inspiration through Clancy and the Overflow, Banjo Patterson, and our forefathers and mothers who have pretty much shaped the path that we're walking on today. And they were people that held together. They were strong people. And that's who we are as Australians. So with that, I send you love, peace, and courage. Thanks.